Good evening. On behalf of KPCC and LAist, welcome to this special virtual event with LA District Attorney George Gascón and our very own Frank Stoltz on the occasion of the DA completing his first year in office. I'm John Cohen and I manage live programming and events for KPCC and LAist. While we continue to look forward to the return to in-person events, we're pleased you've joined us online this evening. Speaking of, be on the lookout for updates on our Public Radio Palooza series, a year's worth of events celebrating public radio and the folks that make it happen. Speaking of making it happen, all of the programming on KPCC and LAist is made possible by the generous support of our members. Thank you to all of you. If you're not already a member and you're in a position in which you can give, you can visit us online at support.kpcc.org/in-person. While you're there, if you want to stay up to date on upcoming events, virtual and in person, please sign up for our events newsletter. Throughout this evening's event, I invite you to engage with us and ask your questions in the chat. To join the chat, you should see a prompt to sign in right under this video window. Just enter your name to access. For questions, let us know your name and where you're joining us from. A live text transcript of the program is also available directly under the chat window. And if you want to go back and watch this event again or share with somebody who wasn't able to join us in real time, the full event video will be right here where you're watching now. You can find this page at kpcc.org or at laist.com. Without further ado, KPCC and LAist criminal justice correspondent, Frank Stoltz.
Thank you, John. Tonight we'll be talking, of course, with LA District Attorney George Gascón, who took office almost exactly 1 year ago today. As many of you know, he's a one-time LAPD cop turned reformer. He rose to assistant chief of the LAPD, then served as chief of police in Mesa, Arizona, and San Francisco, and then DA in San Francisco for several years before being elected LA DA, beating incumbent Jackie Lacey last year. Now, many describe him as probably the most prominent and aggressive of a new cadre of progressive prosecutors across the country. Welcome, Mr. District Attorney.
Good evening, Frank. How are you?
Glad you're here. Thank you.
My pleasure.
I think it's safe to say it's been an extraordinary year in criminal justice in Los Angeles. We've got a lot to talk about it, so let's get right to it. First, I want to note that a number of our questions tonight echo those raised by KPCC listeners and readers of LAist.com. So thank you guys for sending questions in. DA Gascón, I'd like to start out with the surge in crime. There's been a spike in what's known as smash and grab and follow home robberies over the past few months. And more ominously, there's been a 17% increase in homicides this year, as you know, highlighted by last week's murder in the middle of the night of 81-year-old philanthropist Jacqueline Avant in Beverly Hills, the killing of a 12-year-old boy, Alejandro Alvarado, in Wilmington on Monday, and then just on Tuesday, the killing of 14-year-old Jeremy Galvin in Boyle Heights. What do you think is going on here?
Yeah, you know, Frank, and first of all, look, my heart goes out to the families of this three victims of violence, gun violence, as well as, frankly, the hundreds of others that unfortunately continue to suffer not only the results of violence, but the results of gun violence in this country. We have an epidemic proliferation of guns, and LA, unfortunately, has not escaped the national trend. We're right up there. In fact, I was just listening this a few minutes ago, news about 12 major cities that have significant increases in homicides year to date. And I know you know the numbers, but we had an increase in 2020 as a nation, and now 2021 continues that trend. And it is complicated, right? It's complicated because there are so many layers that are driving the violence. I think that you can listen to criminologists and academics, and you can look at data, and there are different conclusions. Obviously, if you talk to law enforcement, they often in our city and our county, they blame sort of a more relaxed or more reform-minded prosecutor. But all you have to do is even go across county lines in the state, and you see counties that are being run by very conservative, law and order prosecutors that per capita are having bigger problems than we are. At the same time, we know that in general terms, crime is down, right? So it's this complicated picture where homicides are obviously up, and certainly the fear of violence and the follow home robberies and the snatch and grabs are all capturing our collective attention, and they need to be addressed. And yet it's important that we maintain a balance so that we can get actually to what are the root causes of this problem and deal with them at the same time that we deal with the here and now. So for the here and now, sort of the immediacy, we're working with law enforcement, especially the LAPD, since they have the largest jurisdictions being impacted with the smash and grabs and some of these new searches. And I've actually now moved all this crimes to our organized crime division, and we put our cyber crime division to work together because we understand two things. Number one, especially with some of the follow home robberies and some of the snatch and grabs, they often appear, they have a flavor of a more organized effort. And I want to make sure that we have a very surgical focus on those folks to make sure that, number one, the behavior stops, and two, that people are held accountable. And the police department is putting a lot of efforts in this area. Long term, we need to continue to
well, before we get to the long term, let me follow up on something that you hit on, which is that some have blamed the increase in crime on your policies of seeking shorter prison sentences. We know this crime surge began before you took office, and as you point out, it's happening in a lot of cities across the country. And then it's probably too early for your policies to have taken an effect. But what about this argument that maybe your posture and your signaling that you're going to seek shorter sentences has emboldened or have emboldened criminals?
Yeah, look, I mean, I know that's a popular talking point for some people, and certainly some people in the community. When you're afraid, you're trying to look for causation, right? But the reality is that when you look at crime in general terms and you look at what is deterrent or not, we know that long sentences do not deter anybody. Now, you can argue that incapacitation does, and you can imprison somebody for a very long period of time. Obviously, they don't get to commit a crime while they're in prison. The problem with that is that there is the consideration that 95% of the people that we send to prison are going to come back, and often coming out of prison creates more problems for us, both economically and socially. So to the point that you made, and I'm glad that you made that point, the policies that I have implemented, people are still going to prison. In fact, our fighting rate for felonies is very, very close, within 2% of what it used to be in 2019 under the prior administration. People are just not going to prison for 50, 100 years as they were before. They may be going to prison, depending on the crime, 10, 15, 20, 30 years. So even if those policies had an impact, you got to wait a long time before those people get released.
And I do want to get into that, but I guess maybe to kind of zero in on this, in the past, of course, we'd see a DA say, "Look, we're going to go after these guys. We're going to nip this in the bud." You haven't been particularly vocal on it over the last year. In other words, do you think that a DA's words and his posture can make a difference in terms of some deterrent effect or some effect on the atmosphere?
Look, zero, right? I've been in this business for around 40 years. I've worked with very vocal police chiefs. I work with police chiefs that were less vocal. I was a police chief myself in 2 major cities. Sometimes sounds good. There are good sound bites about, don't come to our town, you'll pay the consequences, kind of the cowboyish approach to it. But the reality is that the people that are committing crimes are not listening to this, much like they're not listening to whether you're going to get the death penalty or, that doesn't enter the equation. And that's not me saying it. That's the reality that is backed up by years of data and studies. I think what it does work is when you try to work in concert with all the other partners, and that includes community and other stakeholders and law enforcement, to get to the root causes of the issue, identify who are the chronic offenders, and then address them and provide the right levels of intervention. And that is precisely what we started to do with violence as early as the summer. We created our community violence reduction. We have prosecutors and investigators embedded at LAPD stations right now, and we're working very closely. We're bringing community, we're bringing county health, and we're dealing with this on multiple levels, understanding some people will be prosecuted and will go to prison. There will be other times when we can intervene and prevent the crime from occurring in the first place. The bravado, the standing on the soapbox and, don't come to our town because the consequence, that doesn't work. It sounds good for TV. I know that it makes great sound bites, and I'm sure that it feeds the egos of some people, but the reality is that it doesn't get the work done. And frankly, sometimes actually, I believe that is counterproductive, not in terms of crime going up or down, but I think it often creates a wedge within communities where people feel that they're being singled out because of who they are.
Okay. Let's take a step back for just a second. Your fundamental analysis of the criminal justice system in California is that it's been overly punitive and racist, and has resulted in the mass incarceration of particularly Black and Latino men. Perhaps your most controversial policy is designed to address this is to seek shorter prison sentences for people who commit serious and violent felonies. And you're definitely doing that. Our data we reported on LAist found that the number of times your office sought longer sentences for people who use a gun fell by more than 60% during the first 6 months of this year, compared with the average of the first 6 months of the previous 9 years. And you virtually no longer file gang allegations and plan to seek the release of people who already are serving time, extra time in prison for gang and other sentencing enhancements. So I guess what I'd like you to do is justify this in terms of, on the face of it, certainly over time, people would have said, gee, reducing sentences for people who are committing serious and violent crimes, and particularly at this moment, is not a good idea.
Yeah, first of all, let's, for the audience, Frank, because I know that you know this very well, but some of our listeners may not know this. When we're talking about shorter sentences, it doesn't mean that people are not going to prison for long periods of time, right? We're sending people to prison for decades, sometimes multiple decades, depending on the crime, sometimes less. We're not sending people to prison at the rate that the prior administration or frankly other district attorneys do. So maybe where we send somebody to prison for 20 or 25 years to life, they would have been sent for 50 years to life or life without the possibility of parole, depending on the case. And the reason why we're doing that is there really are multiple layers to this. Number one, there's certainly at least some indications based on some studies that show that there is a sweet spot between incapacitation and sentencing where people actually start to, their criminogenic or their likelihood to recidivate increases to some point when they are spending a longer prison sentence, short of obviously being in prison for decades where, they, by the time they come out, they're very senior and they no longer pose a danger to most of us. So what we are trying to do is really kind of follow that data and look at the economics and the social impact, right? I think that often a thing that is not often discussed is that when we make a decision to send somebody to prison, it's a huge monetary commitment, right? And by that, I mean, it's to the taxpayers, how much money we're going to pay. 10 extra years in prison translates probably into about $1 million. So if you can send somebody to prison for 20 years and incapacitate them long enough so they get age out of crime, and you avoid the last 10 years, you're saving $1 million, right? And you multiply that by hundreds and hundreds of people, and pretty soon you're talking about really serious money that could be used for education. It could be used, quite frankly, for rehabilitation and for other services. We spend about $16 billion a year in prison here in the state of California. And yet you have people like the individual who murdered Mrs. Avant, who had, been in prison in and out since very young. He spent the last 10 years in prison. He actually was not early released. He completed his time. His history of violence was very high. and no fault of CDCR, by the way. I'm not blaming them. It's just the way the system works. He gets released, and frankly, he's out there to figure it out for himself. He is clearly a person with a history of violence. Then he gets access to a military-style weapon, an AR-15, and he goes and commits murder. This was predictable, not as to Mrs. Avant, but the fact that he was going to do something horrible was very predictable. And one of the things that I'm saying, and frankly, I'm going to spend a lot of time this coming year now that we have a management team in place and all that, is really working at the state and the local level to make sure that we follow more of a, the German or the Norwegian or the Scandinavian model, where the model is, if you're going to get out, and 95% of the people are going to get out, we're going to start working in the exit strategy immediately. So what does that mean? We're going to get you mental health services, make sure that we're taking care of your physical well-being, make sure that we start getting you job skills and dealing with substance issues and all those things, so that when you do get released, you're also being released into a place where you can get marketplace housing, you can get employment, and hopefully you will be a productive member of society.
Well, even folks I talk to who are supporters of your policies, are extremely worried that those services are not in place now. So, even if they agree with shorter prison terms and letting people out earlier, they're worried about this risk where folks are getting out without any support and may very well commit more crime.
And that is a real worry. And I would say a couple of things to that. Number one is absolutely a truism. On the other hand, look, I've been in this business for over 40 years. And for the first time in my career, I actually see an abundance of resources to begin to do the work, right? We are fortunate enough to have a tremendous surplus at the state level. We have a federal government now that is going to invest in this work. And we have at the county leadership, we have a board of supervisors has already been gearing up for this. So we're already working, for instance, with the Amity Foundation, which is very much following the Scandinavian model, where CDCR is releasing people kind of around their last 2 years of prison. And they go into this setting where they continue to have custody setting to some extent, but they start working on employment, they start working on education, they are working on the mental health issues. And actually under the Amity program, the goal is by the time that you are completely cut loose, you are able to pay market rate rents. You have employment that is meaningful employment. We're not talking about some, a short order cook at some, fast food restaurant.
Yeah, I don't think anybody's going to argue with what you're saying, but the problem always in LA has been scale, and we're nowhere close to the scale. I think you'll stipulate that providing these services. So let me move just on just a titch from that, and because you bring up the Jacqueline Avant story, it's a good case study. Your policies. Under your policies, I think, as I understand it, you'll seek a 25 years to life sentence for her alleged killer.
Actually, that's incorrect, because no, he's facing a couple of things. Number one, and again, I'm really glad that you bring this. Our policies have exceptions, right? We recognize, but I want to make sure the exceptions don't swallow the rules. So we have exceptions to file gun enhancements. We have exceptions to file strike priors, or to file, as in this case, an enhancement for gun for somebody that was convicted of a prior crime and has a gun. So in his case, he's being charged with Mrs. Avant's murder, but he's also being charged with the attempt murder of the guard in the house. There are two residential burglaries, the one in Mrs. Avant's house and the other one in the Hollywood Hills. There is the enhancement for being someone that has been convicted of a crime before and now was carrying a gun, and there are strike priors. So actually, his exposure is over 100 years. Now, clearly he is an exception. It's not the norm of the way that we would follow, but this is a case that, that cries out for that level of attention, because it was so violent, it was so quick, and we have all the evidence to present in front of a jury. By the way, obviously it's still up to a jury to convict him not only of of any or all of those crimes. So that's still a work in progress. But his exposure here is significantly higher than that.
Well, not a small number of people would say he should not ever get out of prison. That he should face a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. You You, of course, have taken, you don't believe in life without the possibility of parole. You believe everybody should have a shot at parole that they can change. So under your scheme, even though it's 100 to life, or under my scheme, 25 to life, he's still eligible for his first parole under elder parole, I think after serving 20 years, or at least 20 years of his sentence. So I think he's 29 years old. That means he could serve 21 years in prison before his first eligibility for parole.
Right.
So I guess respond to folks who would say, there are some folks like him that really should not get out of prison.
Yeah. And look, I mean, first of all, only about 16% of the people that go to a parole hearing get released. And that is when they are being recommended by CDCR for release because they have become sort of the model prisoner. Okay. So we first of all need to understand that the majority of people that go in front of a parole board do not get released, even when they qualify, even when they have done everything right. That's one. Two, I think it's important for us to look at the reality that human beings have the capacity of growing and becoming someone different. And frankly, I include myself in that. And I'm sure that you would too, Frank. So the question is, should we look at everybody for the rest of their life based on the worst or the ugliest thing that they did? I know some people will argue that in some cases the answer should be yes. And I suspect, to be honest with you, that in this case, I don't, unless there was a major shifting in policy in the next 21 years, very unlikely that this person is going to get out on parole, certainly on the first time that he qualifies for it. But the reality is that I think that providing that avenue is important for many reasons. And let me give you some of the examples. If you talk to thoughtful prison officials, they would tell you that the worst kind of prisoner to have is someone that has a determinate sentence, meaning they know how long they're going to be there. And unless they screw up really badly, they're going to get out, or, in the case of LWOP, they're never going to get out. They prefer to have people that have what we call indeterminate sentencing, meaning that there is a carrot out there that if you program and if you behave and getting education and do other things, there may be the possibility that you get released.
Yeah.
If you look at most other industrialized nations around the world, we are completely an outlier, right? You get to, places like Germany, Scandinavian countries, all those places, there's always a possibility to get out. Now, you may not get out not because of a parole board, by the way, which is composed mostly today of law enforcement officials, former law enforcement officials, but actually because you have psychologists and psychiatrists that evaluate this person on a regular basis, and they'll say, this person is too dangerous to leave, and therefore he or she should continue to be in custody. What I'm trying to do is I'm not trying to make the decisions today that will foreclose the opportunity for future generations to make their own decisions based on their own structure. And when you do life without the possibility of parole, you foreclose all of that. Now, we still are doing some, by the way, just simply because of the way that the structure of the legal system is. But when you look at most of the rest of the world, in the industrialized world, the death penalty and life without the possibility of parole have disappeared. We're an outlier.
One of your more provocative ideas is that you believe a more lenient approach, less prison time, is not just more fair, but also better for public safety. And you point to some studies, but I want to point you to a couple of studies and get you to respond to them. And you're probably aware of them. There was one in 2012 that's often cited by prosecutors that estimates the average gun enhancement law results in a roughly 5% decline in gun robberies within the first 3 years of its passage. And these are deterrent effects. The other one is a 2007 study that estimates California's 3 strikes law reduces felony arrests of people who already have 2 strikes by up to 20%. These are studies that strongly suggest that these sentencing enhancements, these years that are added on to a base crime have a strong deterrent effect?
Well, I think let's define deterrent, right? If you're talking about,
well, I think I just did, according to these studies.
no, I don't know, but I want to, I want to come back because I think it's important to define. If you're talking about incapacitation as the fact that you cannot commit another crime because you're incapacitated in custody, absolutely, it's very hard.
I think these studies sought to single out incapacitation versus the extra years. They tried to zero in on the deterrent effect separate from the incapacitation.
And they have been debunked, and they have been debunked by many other studies. So let's also put that out there. And I understand that there is an expert for every argument, and you can come up with data to support almost any argument. But I think that when you look at the large majority of credible researchers and data, will say, number one, that except for the incapacitation effect, that lengthier prison sentences have no deterring impact in people committing the crime in the first place if they're out. Number one. Number two, there is, as I mentioned before, there is sort of a balance there where a prison term, other than a multiple decade prison term, has a tendency sometimes where extra years will begin to actually add to your recidivism rate. So to the question that I think that goes to the heart of what I'm espousing and what I think you bring out is, how do we reduce the likelihood of reoffending in order to make our community safer? And when you look at our recidivism rate as a nation, and you compare it with similarly situated nations, our recidivism rates is one of the highest. In fact, it's the highest, not one of the highest. And one of the things that researchers have pointed out over and over again is two things. Number one is the lack of meaningful rehabilitation. And number two, the over-criminalization of behavior, especially lesser criminal behavior early on, which creates a pattern of conduct. And then on top of that, if you want to add the fact that unlike most other industrialized nations, once you have a criminal record in our nation, that becomes a scarlet letter that follows you forever. So even when you're out of prison, you still have this paper prison because you cannot get employment or good employment. You cannot get housing. You are precluded from engaging in so many activities that are part of the social fabric, right? I mean, in the United States, you lose your right to vote if you're a convicted felon. Most other industrialized nations, actually, you get to vote in prison, right? Mm-hmm. Because they will tell you don't stop being a citizen because you're in prison. So the question is, at what point do we take a step back and try to absorb the failures of the past and begin to start moving in a different direction, understanding that as you're exploring, you're going to learn and you're going to see things that work better than others and things that may not work. But to come from a place of assumption that where we are is a good place, it ignores years of research and data that shows that we have done has completely been a failure to us, including when we look at the current wave of crime when it comes to homicides, and you see jurisdictions that follow the hard-charging, tough on crime, and their crime per capita has gone in some cases higher than those that are not.
To help people along here with our discussion, I think we have to make it clear that nobody argues that incapacitation doesn't stop people from committing crime. If we lock you up for another 5 years, you're not going to commit crime during those 5 years, at least not on the streets.
Right.
What you argue is that we don't know if that we had not locked you up for those extra 5 years, that you definitely would have committed crime.
Exactly.
And I know that you point to some studies that suggest that in fact those extra 5 years may make it more likely for you to commit crime, which you're sort of describing as the scarlet letter. In other words, you go down a certain path and it's hard to get off of that path. But when I looked at the studies, though, and I've talked to you already about this, it deals with misdemeanors in Boston. It deals with the juvenile pilot program in San Francisco. It deals with with the low-level drug offenses in Houston. And it doesn't necessarily deal directly with, particularly gun enhancements, but also this 3 strikes law. And so I just want to, I want to give you a full shot at explaining to folks who say, look, there is something called incentives and disincentives. And, there is a deterrent effect, at least according to these couple of studies, where you are going to be less likely to commit, another robbery if you get an extra number of years, if you're going to get, an extra number of years for the gun robbery.
Yeah. I mean, the problem with that, Frank, and I'm going to get to the 3 strikes and all, the problem with that is it makes an assumption that when somebody's committing a crime, they're thinking I'm going to get 10 years instead of getting 5. And there is absolutely zero data or credible studies that say that when somebody's committing a robbery, they're running the equation. If I get caught now under this policy, I'm going to get 5 years. But if I go across the county line, I'm going to get 10 years. That doesn't happen. But here's what does happen. And let's take 3 strikes, because I think 3 strikes is a perfect example, especially if you tag on the other enhancements. We in California went from a prison population of around 29,000 to about 160,000 in a period of less than a decade, from the early 90s to the late 90s. We were so overcrowded, and we built, as you well know, about 22 prisons in that period of time, and 1 public university, by the way. We were so overcrowded that we were churning people in and out with 0 rehabilitation purposes. People coming out of prison with drug addictions, even when they went in without a drug addiction. People coming back out mentally ill, even when they went in without having mental health problems. We saw in our own county jail, people, we forget quickly, but the reality is that most of the low-level offenses, 10, 15 years ago, LA County, they were churning them out within hours because they were under, the pressure to lower the population. And sometimes people that committed serious crimes even were getting released because we did not have enough people. So we're cycling people in and out, in and out. What I'm saying is, I think that we need to come from a place of understanding and accepting that what we have done hasn't gotten us to a good place, and that we need to start exploring different things. And for me, the place to explore different things rather than simply experimenting blindly is to look at what other places, what other countries have been doing for years, and trying to analyze what has worked for them and try to bring some of that to this place. Because I think that the work that we do matters.
Well, of course it does. But we also have to recognize that, I mean, you mentioned this earlier, that Germany certainly doesn't have the gun problem that we have. So in particular, the gun enhancement, which I know you haven't not eliminated using, and there are a couple of different enhancements, the big one, the 10-20 life, and then the smaller one. And you're still filing some of those. But I think that, the concern is that the studies that you point to, and you talk about sort of a scientific, rigorous, empirical approach to your work. At least from the studies I've looked at, I think that and you've even conceded in an interview we did recently that, this is new territory to some extent. You're actually kind of building policies, that have not been looked closely at least in the LA setting. Is that right? Am I characterizing?
No, you're absolutely correct, Frank. But here's where I kind of go back to, because I think, again, I like to contextualize where we are vis-a-vis other similar jurisdictions in the US or even in California, right? Let's take murder, right? Murder is going up in many parts of the state and throughout the country. And it's going up in places where the posture is lock people up for as long as you can. And it's going up in jurisdictions where there is a more thoughtful, more measured approach. So there doesn't seem to be a correlation between the use of enhancements and not. If that were the case, then these other counties that are being led by very law and order prosecutors would have tremendous reductions in crime. We would be up, and then you and I would be having a different conversation, because then I would have to say, okay, there is something going across the county line that is having a different impact that I'm not doing, and therefore I need to look further. But when I look at the problem and I put ourselves side by side with places where they continue to incarcerate at these very high levels, and their rate per capita violent crime is higher than ours, and their homicides have gone up, I need to start thinking about other avenues and other reasons to why we're seeing the increase, because it's clearly not the policy, right? There are other things at work. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to figure out what those other things are.
And just to not put too fine a point out about that one study that's off-cited, the 2012 on the gun enhancements. I talked to the author today, and he, I'm not a social scientist, but I think it's a peer-reviewed, well-respected study. But what he did say is that the deterrent effect was relatively modest. That it wasn't a huge. So at minimum, I think, at least from our reporting, that the idea that there are giant deterrent effects may not really hold water. We've talked a bit about the avant killing. There's another case study I want to bring to your attention that I think will help people understand your policies and maybe you to explain them. And this one involves your policy on juvenile crime, which says no juvenile should be tried as an adult, no matter the crime. And in this case, you talked about this case too, the Andrew Kachu case. He murdered a man when he was 17 years old, sentenced to 50 years to life prison under your predecessor. But your policies allowed his release after serving just 5.5 years in prison of a 50 to life sentence. Now we should note that he would have been eligible for parole at age 37 after serving 20 years. So we should probably do maybe a closer comparison would be 37 down to 5.5 years. But in any case, a dramatic drop. So what would you say to those who don't think that's justice, that 5.5 years is not the appropriate punishment, whether you're talking rehabilitation or not, or recidivism or not, that's just not an appropriate punishment for a murder?
Yeah, and I would agree. And, this was a case that, unfortunately, this is a case that fell into a transition, right, where the state is no longer taking juveniles in the juvenile system.
Well, I'm slightly confused if you agree, because you have a policy where this would apply to any juvenile.
No, but I agree, because the goal was to get this kid into juvenile custody and to make sure that we continue to keep him incapacitated for a period of time to assess, his dangerousness, right? Because under the juvenile system, not only can you hold somebody until they're 25, but thereafter you can actually hold them year by year if you determine that they're dangerous, right? In this particular case, for a variety of reasons, it didn't occur. I know that some people, for instance, blame the prosecutor for not raising the probation report. But the reality is that, I look back at that, by the way, because I wanted to say, have we done anything differently here? Because the judge really kind of hang his hat on that. But the reality is that in this county, many, many cases, you never bring back the probation officer. The court takes knowledge and notice of the report, they read it, and they put that into context. So there were a variety of things that we would probably do differently that we learned from that case. I have never said that the 5 years was an appropriate, measure in this case. But I also have said very clearly that I don't think he or any other juvenile belongs in adult prison. And again, this is where you really have to kind of take a step back and understand that if you put a 15, 16-year-old in adult prison for 20 or 30 years, when they get out, they're still they're extremely healthy, often extremely violent, and it creates more problems than not. And we also know, and this again, it's not my saying, but pretty well established data, that unlike the adult brain, the juvenile brain actually is fairly easily reprogrammed with the right levels of intervention. So we have to look at it from a stand back for a second. And while clearly 5 years was inappropriate, we have to look back at how the human brain develops, what are the interventions that can work or not, and understand that we're much better off holding this person maybe until they're 25, perhaps a little less, reprogramming their process, or if they continue not to be reprogrammed, then on an annual basis, continue to evaluate him, but treat them as who they are, which when they committed the crime, they were children.
That still would have been a 7-year sentence, and he still would have been released. I mean, at prime criminal age. I hate to use that, but
no, that's fine. That's
the criminologists will all tell us
fair.
that people in their mid-20s, you age out of crime about your mid-30s maybe. But he's gets 8 years for a murder, and then is released, at prime crime committing age.
Fair enough, except for, if the system has worked the way that it's intended to work, he would have been evaluated and determine whether in fact he has been rehabilitated or not. And if he hasn't, then he can continue to be held on an annual basis until something differently occurs.
I think only until 25 though, right?
No, beyond 25.
How much longer?
They can be reevaluated on an annual basis. I forgot the terms, but it's several years that can occur.
Okay, so all right, let's move on. Because as I understand, I thought it was a 25-year.
25 is a maximum.
Is the maximum. Okay, so it is the maximum.
But wait a minute. But unless they are determined to be dangerous, and then they can be evaluated and they can be kept for an additional year, and that can occur more than once.
Okay. It's 7:40 now.
And Frank, if I may for a second, because the other argument, the other side of the coin, is that we don't talk about the likelihood of success, which is much greater when we go this approach than when we go through the approach of incarcerating juveniles as adults, which is almost always a failure.
Yeah. And some of this, the discussions I have with folks gets down to what is the appropriate number, punishment, what's justice. In one story I did, a former prosecutor said, domestic violence, somebody hits somebody, a partner, it's I think up to 4 years. If they do it with a gun, it's up to 14 years. And that part of the challenge here is that the way the justice system works is most things are a plea deal, and that when prosecutors are working with an up to 4-year max, it's harder to find the correct number of years that equals justice or is the appropriate punishment, and as opposed to obviously the higher number. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with that comparison is, obviously it's missing a piece, right? If the person assaulted the domestic partner with a gun, then he or she's not facing 4 years because it's probably going to be.
Well, I think that the idea is with the gun, so they hit the person, but have a gun with them.
Okay, so the gun became a club, or it became a blunt instrument to hit someone, not necessarily used as a firearm, right? And that's where I think it's important to point out, because obviously if the gun was actually discharged, that would be a completely different case. It's not the case of using a blunt object or a blunt physical force to harm someone, right?
Okay. People submitted some questions, as I mentioned at the top, and several folks wanted to know why you've decided to no longer file charges for 13 categories of low-level misdemeanors. These include driving on a suspended license, drug and paraphernalia possession, and public intoxication. And my colleague Aaron Mendelson found that over the last year, people were cited or arrested for more than 38,000 such misdemeanors, but not charged by your office. So why shouldn't people be held accountable at all for these crimes?
Well, actually, they are being held accountable. So for instance, in the case of vehicle code violations, we want to make sure that they get infracted. They belong in traffic court, but we should not be using taxpayers' money to quite frankly, prosecute a misdemeanor that, by the way, most of the time these cases were being pled out. There was, very little, if any, consequences. but it's clogging out the system, and it's often a very inefficient way that could have been handled through traffic courts. So we want to make sure that those things get infracted, which is an option, by the way. Driving without a license could be a misdemeanor, it could be an infraction. But when you get into the other things, right, we start, and we're talking about the ones that we're talking about when it deals with substance dependence. We're dealing with sort of the mental health related issues that do not rise to the level of a more serious crime. We go to the Suffolk County study, right, very extensive, going back to 2004, I believe, multiple years, and very clearly shows that sometimes just even filing these cases has a tremendous impact on the recidivism rate of people that, as opposed to the people that are not touched by the system. So the question again becomes, how do you thread that needle? But then the second component that is not being discussed, just because we're not filing a case doesn't mean that we're pushing people into diversion and we're looking for alternatives, because we are. And again, it goes back to the point that you raised earlier, that while it is true that we're still lacking resources in some areas, the reality is that it's building up fairly quickly, because for the first time in my career, we're seeing funding to begin to do this work. So it becomes also a cost-benefit analysis, right? On the one hand, just that intervention alone could actually create more criminality. On the other hand, there are other interventions that might work better. And then finally, there are certain things where just the fact that you got arrested, it's going to have the deterrent effect, right? Not necessarily you get prosecuted, but the fact that you got arrested, right? Or the DMV consequences. So there are many other layers to this that I think it kind of, it's not a binary thing, either prosecution or no prosecution bad, prosecution good, because that's not how the world really plays in our legal system.
Some of the folks I talked to, particularly as it relate to misdemeanors, but other crimes too, there's a sense that people aren't being held accountable, particularly, for instance, when you talk about somebody who's addicted to drugs, maybe on the streets, maybe homeless, obviously needs services, maybe service resistant, but there's not the stick to get them into services. And frankly, I actually know a couple of people like this where, where it was the threat of prosecution that prompted them to act. And I'm sure you hear this a lot around town, around LA, where folks there's a sense that, people, there's no accountability for some folks who need that sort of incentive.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think, again, it's one of those areas where there is nuance and there are multiple answers, right? Almost any of us, especially those of us who have been in the business, can think about the case where somebody was coerced through the threat of prosecution into taking services. Conversely, I can think of many cases where that did not matter, right? We know, and again, if you talk to people that are experts in, mental health and substance abuse and all that stuff, that generally coercive measures don't work. I tell you what, we do have a gap, and one that I plan to work next year. Frankly, again, we've sort of gone through the first year settling certain things, and now we will continue to progress. We need to really beef up our conservatorship rules, right? We need to have the capacity under civil law to conserve people that are unable to make the right decisions for themselves. But there is a distinction between the capacity to conserve somebody civilly and cycle somebody in and out of jail where they're not necessarily getting any better, and all we're doing is we're spinning our wheels. So when you talk about diversion, I understand, and you use the term service resistant, and it's very hard to divert someone that is service resistant, right? Because there's no incentive. Frankly, if you put them in jail for a week or 30 days or 60 days, that's not going to impact them at all. We've done that before, right? And frankly, very few people on those level offenses were even spending the 30 or 60 days because the system couldn't allow it because there was not enough room, right? Yeah. So what is the answer to the service resistant person that is mentally ill? We need to look at civil conservatorship. And what you're doing then is you're starting to peel the onion. You start taking this discrete populations out of the way, so then you can deal with perhaps a smaller segment that they're not necessarily mentally ill. They're not deterred by maybe a short prison or jail sentence, and they're going to continue to act in a socially unacceptable way. And then we have to then figure out what is the right intervention for those people. But the problem is that we have this big mass, right? We have, according to the last count, and I don't know how accurate that is, 60, 70,000 people in the city of LA alone, right? That are houseless. And within that population, you have people that just simply fell out on their luck, right? They couldn't pay the rent, they got evicted, they lost their job. And those people are very easy to fix, right? Find them employment, find some temporary housing, and they usually they fix themselves. Then you got the people that are mentally ill or have substance abuse problems. And some of those are service resistant. And that's where civil conservatorship will kick in. Then you have the criminal element within the groups that is preying on this population, which is also part of the problem.
Yeah.
And that is going to be a different group. And then you have the people that are going to say, you know what, I'm an urban cowboy, right? I just don't want to live by the rules of society, and I want to camp, and I'm not mentally ill, and it's not an issue of employment. And those then, those will self-identify themselves. And then we have to develop the right tools for that.
So you're not filing almost all first offense misdemeanors. When will you know this policy is a success, and how are you going to make that determination? Well,
I mean, look, first of all, it's important to recognize, and here's again where correlation is important, right? LA County has 10 city attorneys that file nothing but misdemeanors, right? Including the city of LA, right? The largest city in the county. Roughly 40% of the population of the county works under the jurisdiction of a city attorney who is filing often those misdemeanor charges. And you go across the county, the city line to another city where we may be the misdemeanor prosecutor, and you see no discernible difference. So if we're saying that, filing this low-level offenses with this population would work, then the city of LA would not have a houseless problem, right? The houseless problem would be in those areas like Compton or, the places that we are the misdemeanor prosecutor. But you would not have that problem in LA, Long Beach, Santa Monica, Pasadena, many other cities. But we do have those problems. So then we have to stop and think, okay, if we have those problems within the areas where this rules are being enforced, and we have the same problem or worse in the place that it's not, what else is causing the problem? And that's when, this is where the activists come in and they say, well, it's poverty, it's inequality, it's a lack of affordable housing, it's a lack of employment, and it's mental health, and on and on and on, right? And if those are the problems, then for me to lock up somebody for 3 days serves no purpose other than take valuable time that could be spent to work on more serious stuff, or quite frankly, try to figure out better ways to deal with this population.
Let me ask you a couple of questions that we've gotten from the audience as we've been talking. From Lionel Mars wants to know, are you working with criminologists or sociologists on finding long-term solutions on reducing crime from repeat offenders? And this is also, of course, the resources question.
Yeah, the answer is yes. We're working with researchers. We're working with other partners in the criminal justice system. Frankly, we're beginning to work with the Department of Justice, the U.S. Department of Justice, just to bring in a trauma-informed care to our victim services. Because one of the things the data clearly shows, the people that are victimized today and have untreated trauma have a tendency sometimes to they themselves become the victimizers of others. So we're trying to pull many levers. We're trying to graft to what is sort of known today. We're trying to work with others. We're working with a whole plethora of nonprofit organizations. And frankly, we're working with our county family, including our board of supervisors, to take those funds that are currently available and try to apply them in the places where hopefully we'll have the greatest impact. and where we don't, then be able to redirect them. You know, the county went through a major investment in this area by creating the Office of Alternatives to Incarceration, and there's funding there, right? And then we have state funding and federal funding coming in, and what we want to make sure is that we're working in concert with all these other professionals, with our public health. We want to have these dialogues because, look, this is a journey. It's never going to be a destination, by the way. I've been working in this business for over 40 years. I know that we're horrified at some of the crimes that are occurring now in some more affluent parts of the county. And my heart goes out to the victims, and I fully understand that. But, the reality is, I remember being a young officer in Hollywood Division when people were doing takeover robberies in restaurants, and they were pruning out the entire clientele and going through their pockets and stealing and sometimes victimizing people. So I say that not to minimize what is going on today, because clearly it's important that we deal with the here and now, but it's important also to contextualize that we got to keep searching for different answers, because some of what we have been doing hasn't worked very well.
Some would say that's exactly what you're doing. You're minimizing it, because there has been a real increase in certainly in homicides, both the 1 year and the 2 year to date, and in aggravated assaults and in robberies. Maybe what I'll ask you is
but let me go back to the homicides for a second, because again, we go back to the same question that we did with the low-level offenses. If my policies were the ones that were causing the homicides to go up, then 2020 we would have had a homicide reduction, but we didn't. Number one, because I was not here. But number two, all those other parts of the country and all those other parts of the state, under very tough law and order prosecutors, would not have the same increases that we're having, or even more increases that we are. So here's the question, right? People keep blaming these policies without looking beyond the county lines, or even looking a year before, when we were operating under a very different approach and we were having increases.
There's another question here I want to ask from somebody who's been listening. Actually, before I get to that question, I want to get to this other question. I want to talk a little bit about what's happening inside your office with your own prosecutors, which I think is important, because, you're the leader of the office. If you want to be effective as DA, you have to have a relationship, with the people you lead. And there is a lot of dissent. One veteran prosecutor accused of retaliating against him because he disagreed with your decision to drop charges in a case, and he's quit, and he's expected to win an $800,000 settlement from the county. That's not a small settlement. And it's clear you did not, you decided against consulting, or at least getting buy-in from the 900 frontline prosecutors in your office before announcing your new policies on the first day on the job. I guess my question to you is, would you do it differently now?
Well, look, there's always the reflection that takes place in looking back. And there's some things in terms of communicating internally that I would probably would do differently today. I think it's important also, again, to look at the reality that I came into an office where we were in the middle of COVID. I walk in my office the first day and the building was empty. And I visited nearly all 22 branches now. And still to this day, you walk in and usually less than 50% of the workforce there. So the normal communication process that should take in the workplace was made even more difficult, not only because of our size, but obviously what has occurred. I think also, unquestionably, the District Attorneys Association, which is a union, is a very outspoken group. They spend a lot of money, dues paying members' money against me during the election, and they lost. And the very first week that I was elected, people immediately started talking about a recall. So I think, it's important to put all that in the mix, because the reality is that at the same time that we are having those issues, we also have a substantial number of prosecutors in the office. Not only are doing what they're being asked to do, but they're embracing this. And, there's a lot of things that are happening. We were not able to hire people for a year. That impacted morale. We're hiring people. We're not able to promote people for a year. We're not promoting. We just promoted somewhere around 60 or 70 people in the last few weeks. So there are a lot of pieces to this puzzle. And I know that often, we're focusing obviously on the people that are most outspoken. The reality is that by and large, the majority of the people in the office are doing what they're being asked to do, and they're doing it well, and they're working under very difficult conditions. And many are not only embracing the policy, but they're actually coming up with their own creative ways to do other things. So it's much more nuanced than what you hear. And frankly, even the people that are against the policies and they're outspoken about it, they're hardworking men and women, and they're doing their job, and they're following, they're following the law. And I understand, that they may disagree with me, and they have a right to do so. The individual that you mentioned that, that was that we had the lawsuit that you're talking about, this is a very interesting case. And I think the audience should know what happened here, right? Because actually it's very public. So I'm not saying anything that hasn't been in the Times and everything, but we had a case where a young man was arrested in Compton, and he was charged with a felony attempting to derail a passenger train. And this individual was actually an individual who had been involved in anti-police protests, including protesting in front of a public official's home. I'm not going to mention who. And the case was presented to our office, and there was a video, and evidently nobody reviewed the video, because if you review the video, you see actually that the alleged conduct never occurred.
Well, before we get too far down the details of this case, and I know details are important,
okay.
But essentially there was a disagreement of opinion. I mean, here's a guy who's been a prosecutor forever in the office, and he had an opinion, and you had a different one. And I think, at least what, the concern I hear from, the deputy DAs who love to, bend my ear all the time is that, hey, he doesn't respect, prosecutors within the office. And, your characterization that everything the office has done until now has been, overly punitive, has not been in the interest of public safety, has not cared about, the well-being of the community. I think that's sort of, the general, the gist of how some of your prosecutors feel you treat them.
No, I hear that, but I think it's important to go back to some of the details in this case. This individual was wrongfully charged, right? We have video that show that he did not engage in the conduct that was alleged.
But the other two, I'm familiar with the video, and the other, that's why I don't want to get too far into this case. Okay. The other two may very well have the video showed that they were involved, possibly.
But the other two, were not the subjects of this. Well,
the entire case was thrown, right?
Well, and by the way, when you look at what they put, they threw a plastic, kind of a plexiglass plastic thing on the track. Hardly anything that is going to derail the train, but clearly not the person that was arrested and that have been charged.
Let's get to other questions that are probably better than my questions at this point. Let's see. Let's ask this question from Thea Esky. LA is currently in the midst of a massive child abuse crisis. This failure has led to a lot of children dying. What concrete steps is your office taking to address the child abuse crisis in LA County?
Yeah, and look, I mean, this is an area that I care deeply about. And in fact, I spent a lot of time talking to Mr. Cagle, who unfortunately is leaving. And I actually feel bad, because I think he was a real professional and someone that was bringing discipline and a different approach to the work of Child Protective Services. It's a combination of things, right? And I think that we need to understand the role Child Protective Services has in intervening. I think that we also have to understand the separating of people, especially family members, from in cases of communities of color. By the way, none of this gets to the criminal justice system yet. So I'm kind of walking you through the journey. And then you get to the unfortunate cases where there is a criminal reporting, and then we step in and we either prosecute or not the case based on the evidence. The problem with all this, and I appreciate Fiat's raising this, because frankly, I believe that this COVID has intensified this, and that's why dealing with mental health issues in our community are increasingly going to become more problematic. In fact, there was an article today in the LA Times about just this increased instability with young people and the impact that COVID is having on their mental health, which, by the way, these are the people that will be the adults and the parents of tomorrow. We are going to have to take a much more, I don't know if enlightening is the right way, because I don't want to disparage people that are working very hard in this area, but we're going to have to start tweaking the system to figure out how to intervene early enough, how to prevent, how to educate parents. And then, unfortunately, my office and my work really comes when everything else fails. And when that occurs, we are taking action, and we have really very good prosecutors that deal in this arena. And we're beefing up our victim services to try to deal with the other part of the equation. But really, the solutions are going to be far from satisfactory when it comes to my work. Conversely, if there are criminal negligence on the part of anybody within the chain of services, then obviously those are the cases that I would look at it closely, and if appropriate, we would seek prosecutions.
You've hired a special prosecutor to look at potentially filing charges against police officers involved in shootings that already have been determined to have been legal by your predecessor. Where are you at on that? In fact, you're reviewing hundreds of shootings that already have been determined to have been legal shootings by police officers.
Right. So there are two components to this. The special prosecutor, who is someone that is a former U.S. attorney, a former head of the Civil Rights Division locally, very experienced criminal attorney. He's looking specifically, beginning with 4 cases, and he is, he's going through doing his due diligence in these cases, and we anticipate he'll come up with some final recommendations in some of those cases early part of next year. I think the other component, the one that you alluded to, the hundreds of cases that are being looked at, we're looking at cases going back to 2012, and that's a little different look back. That is a look back where we have a law school clinic, we have a group of volunteers that includes both expert use of force and former law enforcement officials, including former chiefs of police. We have civil rights attorneys, and we have community members. And as the law school screen cases where they believe that evidence contradicts the description that the office provided when they declined the case, then it goes to this next group. They themselves screen them out, and then they were referring to me, and then we will go from there. The goal here is not necessarily that they're going to be hundreds of prosecutable cases. Quite frankly, many of these cases, the statute of limitation has expired. It's really a retroactive look to assess, are there any cases that should have been prosecuted that could still be prosecuted? That's one. But more importantly for me, quite frankly, what are the lessons learned? What didn't we do that we should be doing in the future? And that is also part of the process. So there are different components to this that are going on at the same time.
You're facing your second recall. The first one failed this year, and now opponents of your policies are seeking to second recall. They have to collect, I think, 580,000 signatures to get it on the ballot. And the signature gathering is expected to start sometime early next year. This is led by a lot of family members of victims who feel like you should have been tougher with the perpetrators of the crimes against their loved ones. And of course, it's being led by folks who just have a different philosophy, more traditional philosophy of prosecuting. So what is your response to this second recall? Are you worried about it? They say they have more money this time to collect the signatures, to get it on the ballot.
Yeah, I mean, look, they spent $1.4 million, by the way, on the first one. And there's certainly allegations within those groups that there was some mismanagement of that money, but that's not for me to determine. Look, the recall process is within our constitutional system in the state. And far for me to say, obviously from a personal point of view, whether that is a fair or unfair process. The reality is that it's a vehicle that is there for the voters when they are unhappy with an elected official, and that is the recourse that they have in order to, quote unquote, fire you from the job. And I respect, within the group of people that are seeking the recall, there's a group that I respect, are those that are, that have been harmed and they're in pain and they feel that somehow the system and I have failed them. And, it's their opinion. I frankly, my heart goes out to them, right? People are in pain, and that's not a place that any of us want to be. I cannot direct public policy based on just single cases. We have to look more globally, and not only the victims of today, but the victims of the future. And one of my goals is to reduce re-victimization by the work that we're doing. There are other people in this group that are purely motivated by political things, right? There are, people that want to be district attorney, people that were district attorney that want to be district attorney again. There are people that are purely motivated by funding, right? We know that $1.4 million, nearly enough, was spent with very little results for it. But at the end of the day, it will be up to the public, the voters of the county, to determine whether they believe that I'm taking the work in the right direction or not. And I will respect, obviously, and I respect the process because I think it's important. I was elected by the very same process, not by the recall, by an election, and I won by a widespread, which means that the policies that I implemented were the policies that I promised. I'm one of the few people that you can say without any equivocation that the things that I said I would do, I have done. But if for whatever reason, at the end of the day, the voters decide that they no longer want to go into this direction and they want to go back to the past, then, that is the democratic process. And clearly I respect the process.
One of the most interesting things, maybe I should ask this question and then I'll two more quick questions. The first is from Filiberto, who asks about the prosecution of gangs in the sheriff's department. Do you believe that there are gangs within the sheriff's department? And of course, some folks identify them as subgroups. The Rand report that looked at the existence of them variously describes them as subgroups and as deputy gangs that either intimidate other deputies who don't go along with their policies and their practices of harming people. What are your thoughts on the existence of them and what should be done about it?
Yeah, look, I mean, clearly the Rand Corporation did a study and they found that they exist, right? And then the Inspector General of the county has also done his own investigation and he's determined they exist. And then the county has paid huge settlements on cases where it has been alleged the deputy gangs have victimized other deputies. And you have to presume that the county is paying such a large sums of money because there has to be some acknowledgement that certainly subgroups, or whether you want to call them a subgroup or a deputy gang, exist, right? But one of the few people that are denying that they exist is our current sheriff. So I say all this to say that certainly there's tremendous amount of evidence that seems to support that they exist. And this is something that obviously I have a concern, and it's something that we are looking at it very, very closely. And we will do and are doing our due diligence to determine what, if any, interventions I can impact from where I sit. And I think it's important also to understand for those that are listening that, there are administrative interventions, there are civil interventions, and there are criminal. Obviously, criminal interventions are the highest. in terms of the standard of proving the things have occurred. And so, there's probably many other interventions that will take place that may be more effective than the criminal, but I would not rule out that we would also use that when it's appropriate.
This is a last question. One of the sort of the most interesting ideas or critiques of you is that you're engaged in an experiment in LA County. It's hard not to sort of consider that, given that the changes are sweeping. You truly are in a dramatic fashion seeking shorter prison terms, no longer prosecuting most misdemeanors. They're breathtaking, and they do reverse decades of prosecutorial practice in the county. And so, just maybe finish on that. I mean, the idea that this is an experiment in LA County, and that the stakes are high if it goes wrong in terms of public safety.
To me, it's not an experiment. I'm going to tell you why. And this is something that I heard recently, and I'm borrowing from someone else. But when we implemented 3 strikes or the enhancements, and we incarcerated at a horrendous rate, it was an experiment because there was no data to show that stuff worked. But nobody questioned that. But now when we're beginning to look at the mistakes of the past, and we're trying to unwind some, and we're looking at other jurisdictions that are doing this work, and other countries and other places within the US, and have proven to show that some of the things work, all of a sudden this is an experiment. I would not say that this is an experiment. I would say more that this is a sort of a shifting in direction, trying to see policies and practices in other places that yield better results, and trying to making applicable to our reality. Unlike what we did until just a year ago, where we were incarcerating people at very high rates and still not really seeing a return for our investment.
I'm going to look up my adjectives and see if verbs or shift is the right one for this one. But I appreciate your time, Mr. DA. We appreciate your time at KPCC and at LAS.org. And thank you guys for tuning in. And if you missed a part of it, you can see the entire thing at kpcc.org. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you so much, Frank, and thank you to all the listeners. Thank you.